They wear masks so convincing that even truth itself hesitates before speaking. Their smiles are rehearsed symphonies, their words silver blades dressed as compliments. Narcissists move through the world like actors trapped in their own theater, terrified of silence, because in silence the illusion collapses. And yet, among the sea of faces that adore their charm and obey their manipulation, there is one presence that disturbs their entire existence, the empath who sees through them. Because to a narcissist, exposure is death. They live not to be known, but to be admired. They survive not by authenticity, but by attention. The empath's gaze, the quiet, penetrating awareness that does not seek to control or to please, but simply sees, is their undoing. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But narcissists can never know that privilege. They are prisoners of the mask. Their entire identity is a defense against the unbearable truth that underneath the performance there is nothing solid, nothing sacred, nothing real. Every narcissist you've ever encountered began as a wounded child, abandoned, unseen, or overly praised for what they did, never for who they were. Somewhere along the line, they made a silent vow: I will never feel powerless again. And so they learned to manipulate emotion the way others learn to speak language. They crafted an armor of charm, confidence, superiority. But the tragedy is this: the armor they built to protect them from pain has become their coffin. Because what the narcissist fears more than anything is not rejection, not failure, not loneliness. It's being seen, truly seen. To be seen is to be known, and to be known is to risk annihilation. Their entire world depends on illusion, admiration, control, and projection. They survive by crafting reflections, feeding off attention, extracting emotion from others to fill the void within themselves. But when they meet an empath, someone who sees beyond words, who feels beyond appearances, the entire game begins to crumble. The empath does not react the way others do. They do not chase validation or fall for charm. They observe, they listen, they feel. And in that silent awareness, the narcissist feels something they cannot explain: fear. The empath's gaze pierces through the persona, through the manipulation, straight into the hollowness they've been hiding from all their lives. Jung called this the shadow, the rejected self, the buried pain, the truth the ego cannot face. The narcissist's entire existence is built upon denying that shadow, but the empath lives inside it. They have made peace with their darkness. They have faced their wounds. And because they have done the work that the narcissist refuses to do, they become immune to the game. This immunity is power. To a narcissist, the empath's stillness feels like mockery. Their compassion feels like danger. Their calmness feels like confrontation, because the narcissist can manipulate everything except awareness. They can fake love, fake remorse, fake understanding, but they cannot fake presence. And presence is what destroys them, because presence reveals the truth. The empath doesn't need to expose the narcissist with words. They expose them with energy. Their silence, their composure, their refusal to engage in chaos, it unravels the narcissist's entire illusion. Jung would call this the battle between the persona and the self. The narcissist clings to the persona, the public mask, the image, the facade. The empath represents the self, the unfiltered, unedited truth. And truth terrifies illusion. That's why the narcissist will first idolize the empath. They will be drawn to their light, their calmness, their depth. The empath's grounded energy feels like oxygen to their suffocating ego. But soon, admiration turns to envy, and envy to hatred, because the empath mirrors back to them what they could have been if they had chosen healing over performance. The empath embodies authenticity, the one thing the narcissist has buried beneath years of masks and manipulations. The narcissist feeds on attention. The empath feeds on understanding. One consumes energy, the other creates it. One performs to hide pain. The other feels pain to find truth. This difference is not just psychological, it's spiritual, it's archetypal. The narcissist is the eternal actor. The empath is the eternal mirror. And when the mirror stops reflecting admiration and begins reflecting truth, the actor begins to fall apart. This is why the narcissist must destroy the empath, or at least discredit them, because they cannot control what they cannot deceive. So they will twist the narrative. They will project their own darkness onto the empath, painting them as unstable, dramatic, cruel. They will accuse them of everything they themselves are guilty of. But this too is fear in disguise. The narcissist is not fighting the empath, they are fighting exposure. They are fighting the collapse of their false identity. Because deep down, beneath all the manipulation, there exists a terrified child still hiding in the dark. A child who learned that love was conditional, that truth was dangerous, that vulnerability meant pain. Every narcissist you meet is that child trapped, unhealed, unintegrated. But the empath's presence awakens that buried shadow. And for the narcissist, that awakening feels like death. Because in a way it is. The false self cannot coexist with truth. It must dissolve, it must die. And that death, though psychological, feels like annihilation to the ego. That's why narcissists fear empaths, not because the empaths will destroy them, but because the empaths will unmask them. And there is nothing more terrifying to the ego than the death of its mask. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The empath lives this truth. They have done the inner work, faced the inner storms, met their own shadows without running. They have made the unconscious conscious, and that makes them powerful beyond measure. The narcissist, however, refuses to look inward. Their entire existence depends on projecting the unconscious outward. They blame, manipulate, and gaslight because they cannot bear the mirror of their own mind. The empath, having faced their own mirror, becomes immune to theirs. That's why narcissists cannot truly control an awakened empath. They can confuse, they can provoke, they can attempt to wound, but they cannot possess. Because once you've faced your own shadow, no one else can weaponize it against you. That is the empath's secret strength. The calmness that the narcissist mistakes for weakness is, in truth, mastery. The empath's silence is not submission, it's sovereignty. The empath's compassion is not naivety, it's awareness. The empath's distance is not coldness, it's clarity. They see through manipulation because they've seen it within themselves. They know what pain makes people do. They know what ego does to survive. They know the language of masks, and they refuse to speak it. And that refusal drives the narcissist insane. Because without reaction, the narcissist has no power. Without admiration, they have no identity. Without control, they feel exposed. And that exposure feels like death. So they will flee or they will fight. They will try to provoke the empath into chaos, to make them feel small, to lure them back into emotional captivity. But the empath no longer plays the game. They've evolved beyond the battlefield. Jung said that every transformation requires the death of the old self. The empaths awakening their decision to stop engaging with toxicity is their transformation. The narcissists collapse when they lose control is theirs. One ascends through awareness. The other crumbles through denial. That is the final mask, the mask of control, ripped away by truth. Because when the empath stops feeding the illusion, the narcissist's world begins to starve. No more admiration, no more reaction, no more supply. And in that silence, the truth emerges. The narcissist realizes that every mask they wore was for an audience that no longer exists. And the empath, finally free, realizes something profound. They were never fighting a monster. They were witnessing a wound. But the wound cannot heal through pity. It can only heal through absence. So the empath walks away not in anger, but in power. because leaving is not rejection. It is revelation. It is saying, I see who you are, and I will not abandon myself to save you from your shadow. And in that act of sovereignty, the empath embodies the very thing the narcissist fears most: freedom. Freedom from illusion, freedom from fear, freedom from the game. The narcissist wears masks to survive. The empath removes theirs to live. And when truth meets illusion, only one can remain. That is the final mask. The moment when the performance ends and reality, cold, clear, and liberating, takes the stage. The empath walks away illuminated, the narcissist left in darkness. Not because light destroys darkness, but because darkness cannot exist where light refuses to hide. But here's what most people never understand: when the empath walks away, it's not just an act of leaving, it's an act of resurrection. The empath's exit is not quiet, it's seismic. It shakes the entire structure of illusion the narcissist built. Because the empath's absence exposes what their presence once concealed: the hollowness. The silence after the empath is deafening, not because it lacks sound, but because it lacks attention. And for the narcissist, attention was oxygen. They begin to suffocate. They wander from one distraction to the next, desperate to fill the void the empath's awareness once illuminated. But nothing satisfies, because what they crave was never the empath's affection. It was the reflection of themselves they saw in the empath's eyes. And now, those eyes are gone. Jung said that man cannot stand a meaningless life. The narcissist, stripped of their audience, faces the unbearable truth. Without illusion, their life is meaningless. Without control, their identity disintegrates. They will try to replace the empath quickly, frantically, with new admirers, new lovers, new pawns. They will tell stories, rewrite history, and perform even louder than before. But every new mask feels thinner, every applause more hollow. Because once someone has seen through you, you can never truly unknow it. The memory of being seen lingers like a haunting. It becomes the shadow they cannot escape, the empath's invisible presence that continues to mirror their truth, even in absence. And yet, for the empath, the departure marks the beginning of something else: integration. For so long they believed their empathy was weakness. They thought their compassion chained them to pain. But through the fire of betrayal, they discovered the truth. Empathy without boundaries is self-destruction, but empathy with awareness is transcendence. They no longer absorb the pain of others. They witness it. They no longer lose themselves in others' chaos. They stay rooted in their own stillness. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, of transforming wounds into wisdom. The empath emerges from the ashes of manipulation as something new, not naive, not broken, but sovereign. They no longer need to fix, to save, or to understand everyone. They've learned that understanding is not always love. Sometimes it's a trap. They've learned that compassion without discernment is martyrdom. They've learned that silence can be the loudest form of truth. And most of all, they've learned that walking away is not cruelty, it's creation. Because in walking away, they create space for healing, for rebirth, for truth to breathe again. They are no longer mirrors for the wounds of others. They are mirrors for consciousness itself. The empath, in their awakening, becomes untouchable, not because they build walls, but because they move without need. The narcissist depends on admiration. The empath depends on alignment. The narcissist performs for validation. The empath lives for vibration. One is addicted to being seen. The other is at peace being unseen. And this terrifies the narcissist, because control depends on attachment, and the empath's detachment is death to their illusion. When you no longer need what someone is offering, they can no longer manipulate you. That is the empath's quiet revenge, not retaliation, not exposure, but evolution. You cannot destroy what has already transcended. That's the moment the narcissist realizes they never truly had power, only attention. And attention, like shadow, disappears the moment light turns inward. The empath becomes the light. They no longer shine to be seen. They shine to see. They begin to recognize the deeper pattern that narcissists are not rare monsters, but manifestations of a collective wound. The entire world is full of masks, of people terrified to be known, addicted to image, disconnected from essence. The narcissist is simply the extreme reflection of what society rewards: performance without depth, charisma without character, ambition without awareness. And the empath's role is not to destroy them, but to wake the world up to the illusion. Because the narcissist is not an individual problem. They are a cultural symptom, a symptom of a civilization obsessed with how it looks instead of how it feels, a symptom of a species that measures worth in visibility, not vitality. And that's why the empath's awakening matters. It's not personal, it's archetypal. The empath represents the return of the soul. They are the antidote to the artificial, the reminder that consciousness cannot be faked. That truth, even whispered, outlasts the loudest lies. When the empath steps out of illusion, they carry a new energy, an energy that changes rooms without words, that exposes deceit without confrontation, that reminds others of their own forgotten depth. They become living proof that you can be kind without being compliant, compassionate without being consumed, understanding without being deceived. They become what Jung called the wounded healer, the one who has turned pain into perception, vulnerability into vision. And this transformation doesn't make them saintly, it makes them sovereign. They understand now that real empathy includes boundaries. Real compassion includes self-respect. Real love includes truth, even when it hurts. They are no longer driven by guilt or the need to be good. They are driven by alignment with reality, and reality, once embraced, becomes power. Because truth is not soft. Truth cuts. Truth cleanses. Truth frees. The empath has faced it not just in others, but in themselves, and now they walk the world unmasked. Their strength no longer comes from saving others, but from saving their energy. And that energy, that grounded, quiet, radiant energy, is what narcissists will always fear, because it cannot be seduced, controlled, or destroyed. The empath has become what the narcissist pretended to be whole. And that wholeness, that integrated self, exposes every illusion simply by existing. The narcissist will keep searching for new mirrors, new masks, new followers, but deep down they will remember the one who saw them. And for the rest of their life, they will be haunted, not by the empath's rejection, but by their vision, the moment someone looked into their eyes and didn't see a god, or a genius, or a victim, but a frightened child pretending to be all three. That was the moment their final mask cracked. And the empath, walking away, carried not vengeance but light. Because the greatest power you can hold over darkness is not to fight it, but to outgrow it, to see it clearly. Love yourself enough to let it go, and never dim your truth for anyone again. That is how the empath wins, not through war, but through awakening. Because no matter how many masks the narcissist wears, truth always knows its own reflection. And the empath has finally stopped reflecting everything but themselves. And when that awakening takes root, when the empath finally steps into that stillness, something almost mystical happens. The chaos that once surrounded them begins to lose its gravity. The noise, the manipulation, the desperate pull of other people's wounds, all of it fades into the distance like echoes from a dream. Because for the first time, the empath is not living from reaction, but from revelation. They have crossed the invisible threshold that few ever reach, the space where energy becomes truth, and truth becomes protection. They understand now that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of presence. It's the realization that no one can disturb the ground you've built within yourself. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, But the empath has done precisely that. They have stared into their own contradictions, their guilt, their longing to be loved, their addiction to saving, and they have loved themselves anyway. And in doing so, they've rendered the narcissist weapon useless, because manipulation only works on those who seek validation. Control only works on those who fear disapproval. But the empath no longer needs to be understood to feel whole. They no longer need to be liked to feel seen. Their peace does not depend on perception, it depends on alignment. The narcissist cannot seduce alignment. They cannot gaslight self-knowledge. They cannot distort someone who is rooted in their own reality. And that is why the empath's quiet confidence feels like violence to the narcissist's ego. Because to the narcissist, control is existence. Their identity is a house of mirrors, and every person they manipulate is a reflection that keeps those mirrors intact. But the empath has shattered that whole of illusion. By refusing to react, by choosing awareness over argument, silence over spectacle, they have done the one thing the narcissist cannot survive. They have withdrawn energy. Energy is everything. Attention is everything. And when the empath reclaims their attention, the entire illusion begins to rot. You can almost hear it, the cracking sound of a false world imploding under the weight of truth. And yet, there is no celebration, no vengeance in the empath's heart. Only compassion, not the naive kind that forgives everything, but the awakened kind that understands everything. Because to see clearly is to see both sides, the manipulator and the wounded child beneath. The empath recognizes that the narcissist's cruelty was never strength. It was camouflage. It was fear disguised as control, emptiness disguised as superiority, self-hatred disguised as dominance. But understanding does not mean returning. You can forgive a person's pain without becoming their victim again. You can wish them healing without joining them in their suffering. That is what true compassion looks like, love without self-betrayal. It's the lesson the empath learns only through fire, the kind of fire that burns illusions to ash, the kind that purifies without mercy. And from that ash, the empath rises not softer but clearer. They understand that their purpose was never to heal others at the expense of themselves. Their purpose was to embody the kind of consciousness that reminds others what healing looks like. They were never meant to fight narcissists. They were meant to outgrow them, because growth is the only revenge that matters. It's not loud. It's not public. It's not petty. It's evolution, the kind that makes everything that once consumed you look small and distant. The empath walks differently now. They no longer look for love through rescue. They no longer seek connection through pain. They no longer confuse empathy with obligation. They understand that love without boundaries is chaos, and chaos always disguises itself as passion before it reveals itself as prison. Now they choose peace not because they're tired, but because they're awake. They realize that their sensitivity, once mocked or exploited, is not a curse. It is sight. They see through words. They feel through walls. They know instinctively what others are hiding, not to judge, but to discern. Discernment is the empath's weapon, quiet, precise, and invincible. Because once you discern, you no longer need to defend. You no longer explain your worth. You no longer justify your boundaries. You no longer argue with projections. You simply exist as truth. And truth, when embodied, needs no defense. The empath becomes like still water, clear, reflective, and untouchable. Anyone who approaches them now must see their own reflection first. And that alone is enough to keep the wrong people away. This is the power that narcissists cannot comprehend, the power of neutrality. They feed on extremes, adoration or hatred, submission or defiance. But neutrality, calm, awareness, starves them, because neutrality is not absence. It is presence without attachment. It is strength without noise. And that level of consciousness is death to the narcissist's game. They can manipulate emotion, but they cannot manipulate energy that no longer reacts. They can twist perception, but they cannot twist stillness. They can wear 100 masks, but none of them work in the face of someone who no longer believes in masks at all. And so, as the empath continues to evolve, the narcissist begins to fade not just from their life, but from their reality. Because what we stop energizing, we stop experiencing. Energy is attention. Attention is creation. And what we stop giving attention to ceases to exist in our world. That's how the empath finally wins, not through confrontation, but through transcendence. They no longer fight darkness. They embody light so powerfully that darkness cannot find them. They become what Jung described as the individuated self, a being who has integrated every shadow, who no longer projects, who lives from awareness rather than ego. They are not afraid of manipulation because they understand the roots of it. They are not afraid of deception because they trust their intuition. They are not afraid of loss because they know they cannot lose what is truly aligned. And that calm, grounded knowing is the most intimidating force on earth, because you cannot control someone who is no longer afraid of being alone. You cannot deceive someone who values truth more than approval. You cannot destroy someone who has already met their shadow and befriended it. The empath has become whole, and wholeness is freedom. Freedom from performance, freedom from projection, freedom from pain disguised as love. They now live from a place of effortless awareness, not forcing, not fixing, not seeking, just being. And in that being, they draw to themselves only those who match their frequency, people who don't need masks, who don't feed on illusion, who understand that love is not a game, but a mirror. The empath's journey ends not with revenge, but with rebirth. They were never meant to destroy the narcissist, they were meant to discover themselves, to realize that empathy without self-awareness is bondage, but empathy with self-awareness is liberation. And liberation, that sacred, silent, steady liberation, is what every narcissist fears most. Because you cannot control what you cannot corrupt, you cannot manipulate what you cannot move, you cannot deceive what has already seen everything. That is the final mask, the ultimate unveiling, when the empath, once wounded and wandering, stands in their full light and sees not just the narcissist, but the entire game for what it is. A theater of shadows, collapsing under the weight of consciousness. And the empath smiles not with pride, but with peace, because they finally understand you don't defeat darkness by fighting it. You defeat it by refusing to perform for it. You walk away, you rise above, and you let truth do the rest. That is the power the narcissist will never know, and the freedom the empath was born to embody. And so, the curtain falls not with thunder, but with silence. The kind of silence that holds power, not absence. The kind of silence that follows revelation. The empath stands at the edge of everything they once mistook for love, and finally understands what they survived was not a relationship, but an initiation. An initiation into consciousness, into truth, into their own strength. They see now that every manipulation, every betrayal, every moment of self-doubt was not punishment, it was preparation. It was life teaching them to stop searching for safety in illusion, to stop confusing pain for connection, to stop trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding themselves. It was the universe stripping away everything false, so that what remained would be unshakable. And what remains is not bitterness, it is clarity. The empath has learned that true love is not found in drama, but in depth. It is not built on performance, but on presence. They no longer crave the highs of validation or the chaos of being needed. They crave peace, and they know peace is not boring, it is sacred. They have discovered that their power was never in their sensitivity alone, but in their ability to remain sensitive while growing boundaries of steel. Soft heart, strong spine, that is the alchemy of the awakened empath. They can feel everything without being destroyed by it. They can see darkness without fearing it. They can love without losing themselves. And that is the kind of human the narcissist can never become, because the narcissist fears depth. Depth requires surrender, and surrender requires authenticity. The empath, however, has learned to surrender not to others, but to truth. And in that surrender, they have become unstoppable. They no longer chase love. They attract resonance. They no longer explain their worth. They embody it. They no longer ask for peace. They are it. That is why the narcissist and all who live through illusion will always be haunted by them. Because the empath has done the one thing illusion cannot survive, they have become real. They have turned wounds into wisdom, empathy into intuition, and solitude into strength. They have learned to walk through the world with quiet eyes and a knowing smile, not needing to expose anyone, not needing to prove anything, because truth does not argue. Truth simply stands. The empath has become that truth, not as perfection, but as presence. They know that there will always be people who wear masks. There will always be manipulation in the world. But they also know this. When you are rooted in awareness, no mask can fool you, and no illusion can bind you. Because once you have seen the world through the eyes of consciousness, you can never unsee it. You can never again be controlled by what you have already transcended. And that is the final victory, not dominance, not revenge, not even justice, but peace. Peace in knowing that you no longer need to fight for what was never real. Peace in knowing that the people who tried to dim your light only revealed how bright it was. Peace in knowing that your empathy is not a curse, it is your superpower, when tempered by awareness. The empath walks forward now, not with armor, but with authenticity, not with bitterness, but with boundaries, not with fear, but with faith. Faith in their intuition, faith in their path, faith in the simple, immovable truth that they no longer belong to the darkness they once tried to heal. Because the empath does not destroy the narcissist, they dissolve the illusion. They become so real that everything false falls away. That is what happens when consciousness meets shadow. Shadow cannot win. It can only reveal what light has always been capable of. And so the empath moves on, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. No closure needed, no explanations given, just peace, vast, grounded, radiant peace. And behind them, the narcissist is left with their mirrors, broken, distorted, silent. They will wear new masks, perform new roles, seek new admirers, but they will never forget the one who saw through them. Because to be seen by an empath is to face the truth you can no longer hide from. That is the curse of illusion. It always meets its end in awareness. And that is the gift of the empath. They are the ending every lie eventually meets. The narcissist fears that gaze because it reminds them of what they've lost, the capacity to be real. But the empath, they no longer fear anything. They have seen the depths of manipulation and the heights of love, the cruelty of ego and the purity of awareness, and through it all, they have returned home to themselves. And home is not a place. It is a state of being. It is the quiet knowing that you are enough, that you are whole, that you are free, that no mask, no lie, no illusion will ever touch you again, because you have become what every mask secretly envies. The face of truth. The empath smiles now, not at the narcissist, but at life itself, because the war is over. The performance is over. The illusion is over. What remains is presence, unfiltered, unbroken, infinite. And that is the final mask removed, the one that reveals who they were always meant to be, the one who sees clearly, feels deeply, and walks away not in anger, but in peace. Because the empath has learned the ultimate lesson. You don't heal the world by exposing its darkness. You heal it by refusing to live in the dark yourself. And that is how the story ends. Not with a wound, but with awakening. Not with revenge, but with rebirth. not with noise, but with truth. The empath no longer reflects the world. The world now reflects them. And the light that once trembled now burns steady, calm, whole, eternal. The final mask has fallen, and what remains is freedom.